Today we're going to talk about the basics of compression as well as my philosophy to compression. Before we start, it's important to know that we carry around a set of compressors with us at all times, and that's our ears. There's something called TTS, which stands for Temporary Threshold Syndrome, where if you've ever gone to a loud concert, when you've walked out, like you're talking very loud,
I can't hear! I can't hear!
You have natural compressors in your ears that actually are protecting you by turning the volume of the outside world down because it was recognizing, like some sort of audio detector circuit, that what was coming in was at a volume that over a sustained period of time would probably damage your ears. This is important for us to know when we're mixing and when we're also trying to understand compression and listen for the nuances of it. I find that monitoring between 65 and 70, 75 dB is good because it gives you a pretty flat balance as far as EQ goes without having any overhyped frequencies, and also allows you to mix for longer periods of time. But with that aside, let's talk about compressors and compression. And there's three things that compressors control. First and foremost is dynamic range. Dynamic range you could think of as the peak and valley of an audio source. And you're talking about the loudest point of it, like the loudest note a bass might play in a riff, to the softest note. A compressor modifies that dynamic range based off the type of compressor we're using and how aggressive we are telling that compressor to be, so it basically will bring the peaks and valleys closer together. The second thing a compressor can control is the coloration of a sound source. There's four things inside a compressor that can impact its tonal characteristics on a sound source. First and foremost is its typology, what type of compressor it is. If it's a varymu compressor, it uses tubes to control the gain reduction. If it's an optical compressor, it uses light bulbs. If it's a FET compressor, it uses a transistor. And if it's a voltage control amplifier, VCA compressor, it also uses a transistor. So what type of circuit imparts a sonic characteristic on the sound source itself? Next would be the rest of the components that are used inside that compressor. Transformers. Big transformers, like found in a Fairchild, will have an impact and help create a robust low end, where transformers that are smaller, like ones found in 1176, increase a little mid-range punch. The third thing is the compressor's attack and release settings. Not every compressor gives us, the user, the ability to dial in the exact attack and release settings that we want. And last is the side chain or detector circuit. Now, you could think of those as like the ear of the compressor. It's what hears the audio coming in and then tells the compressor how to react. So you can imagine just that mechanic alone is going to impart some sort of sonic characteristic. The third thing that it controls is depth. And it's the first thing I want you to think about when you think about compression. And that is front to back perspective. And in order to have front to back perspective, we as humans, we need comparison. So typically we relate these to different sound sources. So it might be a vocal to a snare drum. And if I'm compressing an entire mix and I'm using it to knock back the snare peaks, that's going to push that snare drum back in the mix, thus making the vocal feel like it's coming more forward. So we're going to hop inside the DAW now. I'm going to explain some basic settings and some basic compressor terminology, and we're going to learn how to listen for it, and most importantly, why to compress.
So I pulled up a C2 on a snare sample. Let's talk about some of the basic compressor terminology that we want to know. First is the threshold. The threshold essentially is going to tell the compressor when to kick in. So if I had the compressor threshold set to the top, so you see this line move all the way up to the red there, the threshold basically, again, is going to tell the compressor when to kick in and start doing its thing. So I'm going to lower the threshold down now to a spot where it is inside the peaks of those transient spikes of the snare sample. So we have it in a range now where we could see that red line at the top ducking a little bit, letting us know that the compressor is compressing. Let's move on now to the ratio. When we're talking about ratios, some of the most common ones are 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 10-to-1. The way we can think of a ratio is the bouncer at our favorite nightclub. So if we're telling the bouncer for a 2-to-1 ratio, for every 2 people that show up, let 1 in. We're telling the bouncer for a 4-to-1 ratio, for every 4 people that show up to that door, let 1 1 through, turn 3 away. For a 10-to-1 ratio, for every 10 people that show up to the door, turn 9 away and let 1 through. Infinity to 1 means door is shut, nobody's getting into this party. We're telling the threshold for every 4 decibels the sound source goes. So for this snare drum, every 4 decibels the snare drum goes above the threshold to only actually let 1 decibel through. So we're reducing by 3 decibels. If it was a 10-to-1 ratio, we are telling the compressor that for every 10 decibels above my threshold setting the snare drum gets, turn it down 9 decibels. So obviously the higher the ratio, the more aggressive the gain reduction is going to be. But that also would be dependent, right, upon where I set my threshold. If I set my threshold very, very low and then set it to a very high ratio, we're going to be obliterating that sound source. But if I have my threshold set to a very, very moderate level, again, it's only going to maybe knock things down just a little bit because it depends on how much past the threshold that sound source is getting. So now that we've discussed what the threshold and what the ratio mean, we go to our first coloring knob here, really, the attack. The attack is going to tell the compressor, once the sound source gets above this threshold, how fast do we want you to kick in? But we can think of it like this. Replace fast with the word girth and replace slow with the word punch. The more I am to the fast side of my attack settings, the more girth I'm going to give a sound source because I'm going to be shaving off its transient peak. If I go to the slower side, I'm letting that mountaintop through. So it's going to feel punchier and spikier because of that transient peak punching through. I'm going to put this compressor's threshold down on this snare source to a pretty aggressive setting so that we can really hear the difference. So first I'm going to dial the threshold in and then watch what happens when I move the attack knob and listen to the snare drum and imagine where it is in front of you and see as I move from fast to slow if you feel like you're hearing the snare drum come from further back to closer in front of you. Did you hear that? Now, don't worry if you can't, but I would advise you to pop on a compressor, put it on a kick drum or a snare drum, something very transient, and just move the attack and release back as much as you can till you do start to notice that sense of depth that you're getting with manipulating the attack setting. Your goal would be to be able to hear this within a 1 to 2 decibel gain reduction. So here we're working at around 16 decibels. It's pretty aggressive. Hopefully it's an over-the-top example that you could hear. So now that we've covered threshold, ratio, and attack, let's move to release. Same laws apply. The fast and slow is subjective, and what makes certain compressors different is that they all use different release times. Some will, have a release built in automatically. You might hear things called an auto release. An auto release basically is a compressor that will evaluate what's coming in and determine the release based off what it's hearing. So if it's, just say, for example, some drums and they're short and punchy, it'll release pretty quick. But if you're running a full mix through it, it might release more gradually so that it's more smooth and sustained. And just like with attack, where we talked about replacing fast with girth and slow with punch, let's think of release. Let's replace fast with energy and let's replace slow with smooth. One of the easiest ways to just kind of hear the audio passing through a compressor and hearing kind of the compressor's, grab on something is the fastest attack and the slowest release. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to bypass the plugin. So we have it on a super fast attack, a super slow release, and we're getting like 16 decibels of gain reduction. And watch what happens when I bypass. You're going to hear some subtle differences, but for the most part, the sound of the drum, it remains intact, as opposed to if you remember back to when we were playing with the attack settings and going from fast to slow, how we were radically changing the sound of the snare drum. But with a very slow release and a fast attack, watch what happens. So we knock the transient down a little bit, which is giving the snare a little more room, but you could hear that the general kind of, what is it? The ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release cycle of the drum is pretty similar outside of just shaving off that immediate transient. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you have a very fast attack and a slow release. It kind of gives you, you can kind of hear exactly what the compressor's grabbing and how it's grabbing. So a little trick for you there as you're playing. But again, we talk about, let's listen to that snare drum, we talked about fast being energy and slow being smooth. So let's start with energy and see if you hear it. So this should sound very energetic, like the snare shell is exploding forward, because once the compressor grabs the snare, it's then letting go, and we're getting that shell ring that's going to like pop right out and make that drum feel like it's coming to life. You hear that? The shell sounds like it's exploding. Now let's listen. Same attack setting, but slow. We're back to it feeling more transient, and we've lost some of that girth to it. It's very smooth. We're not hearing the drum pump, but we're back to it sounding like its original source. So we were going from energy to smooth. The last thing of note is what we call the knee. And an analogy for the knee that I like to think of is like a babysitter. A babysitter is told by the parents the rules of the house, and they're told that if the children that they're watching don't follow by the rules, they're not going to get a sweet treat or something like that, right? And a hard knee essentially is that we have our threshold, and the second that we get above that, the second that the children cross that line, the babysitter springs into action, discipline, that's it, no sweet treats.
No soup for you!
That's a hard knee. Now, a soft knee essentially gives warning. That babysitter says, hey, I want you to have that sweet treat. If you guys keep up with what you're doing right now, you're going to break the rules and you're not going to be able to get a dessert. So I'm giving you fair warning.
You better check yourself before you wreck yourself.
And that's what the soft knee is doing. The soft knee basically is going to do some compression before we get to the threshold line, which essentially creates a softer sense of compression. So a hard knee is always great for very transient rich information or very rhythmic stuff, because it gives you that kind of pump and energy, where soft knees can be great on vocals or things that we want a smooth, more gentle sounding compression on. So let's see if we can hear the difference. This might be a tough example if you don't feel that your ears are that attuned yet to compression. But what I want you to listen to is the front of the snare drum. So imagine the absolute Everest peak of the snare, right? Which, mind you, we have a fast attack on it right now, so we're already shaving down. But I want you to listen when we're on the hard knee, okay? You're going to notice it a little bit more. It's just going to feel a little bit more present. When we go to the soft knee, it's going to feel a little smoother. There's a little more snap, and that's what makes hard knees sometimes very good for rhythmic instruments. So now that we've covered the basic terms of compression, let's talk about the most important part of compression, and that is the why of compression. So I have two different sound sources loaded up that both would require compression. First is the natural snare drum that was played inside this beat. So what did you notice about that snare drum? If you don't know, or you might have another answer that I'm not about to provide, drop that in the comments below. It's an inconsistent volume. And when you're talking about songs that are rock-based or pop-based and there's a backbeat, it has to be consistent. So if you have your snare moving at a whole bunch of different volumes, that almost feels like the snare is moving in your mix, and it creates this disconnect in the rhythm. So what we would want to do is we would want to smooth out that snare performance. So we're going to put on the drum bus itself, and I'm going to pull up the compressor on the snare drum, and we're going to try to dial in the snare drum so that we're starting to hear a little more consistency in the snare performance. Okay, let's do a quick before and after listen. Much more solid, much more stable. So let's hop down to the drum bus, and I want to give you an exercise that you can do to begin sharpening your ear to hearing compression and understanding whether you're using it right. A lot of times I get mixes. People ask me if I can listen to their mixes or give them help with a problem mix. And one of the things that I notice a lot of times is that the mix sounds like it's getting trapped in the speakers. It's not coming out into the room. It's not living. And usually that to me is a cue that there's probably some compression mishaps happening, because compression can always start to push things back, especially if you're not listening to the right things or understanding the amount of compression you're applying to something, you might be pushing things deeper into your mix than you want. And when you do, you're actually pushing them almost, you want to think about, back into your speakers more. So I pulled up a compressor and I set it so that we're going to get about 8 to 9 decibels of gain reduction. And here's an exercise you can do. Pull up a bus, just like I did, load in some drums, something transient, and put a compressor on and dial it in so that first you start with just a lot of compression because you want your ear to hear the compression. And then your goal would be to gradually keep reducing the compression until you're getting down to very nuanced levels, somewhere inside a dB or 2. When I hit play, what I want you to do is I want you to focus on the snare drum. Fix your eyes mentally, fix your mental eye on the snare drum. Imagine where it is in front of you, and then visualize whether you feel it moves closer to you or whether you feel like it moves further away from you. What did you notice? The compressor changes the tone of the snare drum. When we are bypassed, the snare drum feels smaller, but it feels a lot punchier. And that is because we have a bigger gap between our peak and valley on the snare drum. So that punch is coming through, but we're not getting a lot of the girth because there's not much else holding on to the rest of that tone post that initial snap. So the drum sounds thin, but it feels like it's in our face. When the compressor kicks in, we have a very fast attack setting, so we're actually bringing the transient down to meet the bottom of the drum. So now we're hearing more of the roominess, more of the sustain, the shell of the drum, but we're losing some of that transient, which makes the snare drum feel like it's stepping back in the mix. So you can see how compression, if we don't really understand it, we just think we're supposed to blindly compress things, and we don't understand how to dial a threshold in or our attack or release, that we can absolutely create the absolute opposite of what we were looking for, where we can make something feel further away when we were trying to make it feel more in your face, or something that feels very snappy and thin, we can make feel even punchier and thinner by dialing in the wrong settings, or if we're going with the analog compressor model, maybe using the wrong compressor for that material.
So today we learned, outside of basic compressor terminology and how to understand the settings of a compressor, we learned the 3 things a compressor can control, which is first the dynamic range, which is bringing the peaks and valleys closer together if we want, and how aggressive we want to do that, and also how that impacts the girth of a sound. We learned the compressor can impact the sonic characteristics of a tone or of a sound source that runs through it based off 4 factors. 1, its typology. 2, the other components that are in it outside of the ones used for its gain reduction. 3, its attack and release settings. And 4, its detector circuit. And then last, we learned how compression can help move things from front to back in a mix or from back to front, and how we do that with controlling the level of transient information in it. So I hope you found this very useful. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy mixing, my friends. See you next time.